where does that leave us as spectators? We continue to look, we continue to interpret, read, or decode the signs for what they tell us about the immigrant experience, about photographic practices in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and about the intersections between the two. One of the central debates around photography in the 19th century focused on the status of the medium, which was believed to reproduce the faithful and accurate representation of its subject. The mechanical eye of the camera was believed to be free of artistic and subjective interference, making the medium ideal for cataloging, exploring, recording, and documenting human experience, activities more closely associated with scientific inquiry than artistic pursuits. As critical debates over the artistic merits of photography as medium flourished, pictorial photography emerged in the 1850s and addressed some of these issues by reducing the technical reference within each frame. Here's an example of pictorial photography. In this image, which is characteristic of the style, we have a slightly blurred or fuzzy image, which gives it a dreamlike quality, turning the subject matter into an allegorical subject. Most of the pictorial images actually played with religious themes. This one in particular speaks more to Burke's idea of the sublime than to any religious theme. In the context of Ellis Island, pictorial photography creates the illusion of a floating station that is suspended in time and space, as depicted in this image. Its colossal architecture, sporting quasi-Gothic arches and turrets, appears to be a city in and of itself. There's no background that suggests entry into anywhere else. It forms the world that you enter into. The second image over here depicted, one presumes, of a newly arrived immigrant family, calls our attention not to the family themselves, but rather to the blurry horizon that we follow, following their gaze, whose backs are turned to us. The photograph conveys the ideal of the American dream, the promise of a more prosperous life which seems barely attainable but remains out of reach. It is across the river, the dream that remains fuzzy, slightly blurred, tangible, yet always deferred, always out of reach. On the opposite camp is what is called straight photography. Emphasizing the technological ability to provide an accurate visual record while focusing on composition and maximizing the techniques that resulted in an aesthetically pleasing image worthy of professional exhibition, straight photography was later adopted into the practices of documentary photography in the 1930s. In this image, which is one of Ansel Adams, actually taken around 1930, the realistic details of the rose perched on a piece of wood are evident. And what is more evident, perhaps, is the camera's ability to show the details of the texture of the petal and the wood that accentuate the photograph's artistic composition and contrast. This image, by comparison, depicts what may be called social realism as immigrants line up awaiting passage or entry into the processing station. This image, however, has a pleasant composition, interplays between lights and shadows, and calls attention to the various textures therein. Notice, for instance, the texture of the clothing, of the various luggage. Notice the shine of the shoes of the man who is overseeing the line versus the relatively unshininess of everybody else's. Notice as well the darkened bowels of the hull of the ship and what that may connote symbolically as the line of fairly uneven heights extends beyond that. And if you look at even at the texture of the hull, you can see where the welding bits of metal are. So again, it just gives the photograph a lot more texture and a lot more detail. But presented under the guise of social realism, the aesthetic qualities of such images are often underpinned or ignored. Photographic images of immigrants in Ellis Island, as Pegler-Gordon argues, can be best described as a mixture between honorific personal and repressive state portraiture. Influenced by sciences of phrenology and physiognomy, Francis Galton developed a system of photographic representation in which, quote, negatives were exposed directly over one another in an attempt to represent the essence of, for example, Jewish facial features. According to Galton, individual details would become blurred, while the features that appeared the same in each overlapping negative, the essence of a given race or criminal physiognomy, could remain clear in the final print. If the frames were not superimposed or the negatives not superimposed, they were presented alongside each other so that, again, one could trace the various similarities in the features that would be common among men convicted of crimes of violence. Alphonse Bertillon, a French police officer and biometrics researcher, created what is called anthropometry, an identification system based on physical measurements that would aid police in identifying criminals. But most importantly, he is responsible for standardizing the mugshot, as the instructions here illustrate how to take your perfect shot. The frontispiece of Bertillon's Identification anthropométrique from 1893, for example, was this mugshot of, quote, anarchist Emma Goldman. And I say quote because she is always referred to as that. It's never Emma Goldberg, it's always anarchist Emma Goldman. Okay, so that's how she becomes known or framed or titled. The mugshot was taken by the Chicago police on September 10th, 1901, after she was arrested for suspected implication in the assassination of President William McKinley. Interestingly, an early copy of the original mugshot was found among the papers of Augusta Sherman, an employee of Ellis Island who is responsible for producing approximately 250 portraits of immigrants from 1905 to 1925. He photographed the same woman while waiting to be deported at Ellis Island a few years later in 1919. The caption reads, "Russian Jewish anarchist Emma Goldman sits for a photograph before being deported on the SS Beaufort, 1919. The similarities between the mugshot and the portrait are telling. The frontal pose, looking straight at the camera angle, the facial expression are all eerily similar, as is the very slight shadow that we find on this side of her face in both. However, the portrait also connotes artistic qualities that the mugshot lacks. And these are qualities of portraiture, insofar as it discloses a fuller image of her head and torso as opposed to a close-up of her face. That includes the detail of lace on her blouse and the background, which is an absent white. A slight angling of her body and a slight tilt of her head, and the details of a wooden chair with what appear to be armrests, right about here, also suggest a more benign, if not natural pose than the institutional emptiness of the mugshot. The numbers used to identify the subject in the mugshot are paralleled with the words used in the caption in the portrait that are used to identify the subject therein. A less repressive example of an honorific portrait is perhaps Louis Hine's representation of an Italian mother and child. Clearly connoting the religious undertones of the Madonna and Child, Hine represents the female immigrant as exemplary of the universal maternal, modest, and self-sacrificing woman, and the child, clothed in white and bathed in light, looking innocent and adoringly at the reassuring figure of the mother. In emphasizing the honorific elements of this image, it is often reproduced as being cropped, removing the faces from behind the iron fence that separate the woman and child from the line of men behind them. So this is an actual fuller shot of the negative. This is how it is often reproduced, so that it defamiliarizes a little bit what is behind, concentrating more on this pictorial reality.